Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about cousins, specifically how to define the relationships between different cousins. I got an email the other day from one of you, and one of your concerns was that not everybody understands what the difference is between a first cousin once removed, and a second cousin. Now that can be extrapolated out to any degree of cousins and any level of removedness. Is that a word? And so I just wanted to explain some really easy ways for you to keep track of all those different relationships. Before I do that though, let me explain to you why it's important. When we're out in the real world at a family reunion or gathering, it's really easy just to call someone cousin, and that's sufficient to just leave it at that. We don't have to exactly say, oh, well, they're my first cousin twice removed, because it doesn't really matter when you're face to face. When you're face to face, saying you're a cousin is sufficient. But when you're putting together a family tree, or even more specifically when you're working with your DNA, the degree of the relationship matters. And so it's important to understand what that degree is and how you come to that conclusion so that you can put people in the proper place in the family tree, so that you can understand the genetic relationships that you're looking at on your AncestryDNA match list. So just really briefly today, we're going to cover what those different definitions of a cousin mean and how you can figure out those relationships for yourself going forward. Let's go ahead and dive in. So I've just created a really basic chart here so that I can explain to you how cousins work. Now this is something you should be familiar with, right? If you have a parent and that parent has a set of parents, those would be your grandparents. Your parents' siblings would be your aunts and uncles. And any children your aunts or uncles have would be your first cousin. Now, again, normally we would just call that a cousin, but first cousin is an important distinction genealogically and genetically. So then, how does a cousin become removed? Well, if your first cousin has a child, that child is your first cousin one time removed. And hopefully this chart makes it really clear why that is. Your parents' siblings, you and your first cousin, and then there is a generation removed from the common set of ancestors here, which are your grandparents. So removed simply means they're not in the same generation, okay? So we could continue to do that over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, if we come out here, let's see if I can edit this while we're live here. If I come out here, I can just click on this particular first cousin once removed, and I could add a child for them, and that child becomes your first cousin 2 times removed, okay? That's how that works, is any time you're going off a generation from the common set of ancestors, we use the word removed. Now, I hesitate to do this because I don't want to confuse people, but here's what the misconception sometimes is. There are people who think that this is where you start counting second cousins, third cousins, and that is not the case. Again, a cousin of any degree will always be in the same generation as you, and as soon as you start adding generations, children or grandchildren of a cousin, that's when it comes to first one time removed, 2 times removed, etc. Okay, so let's see if we can totally confuse you now. Okay, that was basic. Now we're going to step it up a level. So we're going to add a set of, oh, I did that wrong here. See, I knew doing this live was going to be a little tricky, but I wanted to make sure we could have this be a little bit more dynamic. Okay, so we are going to add a set of great grandparents for you. So you have a parent, a grandparent, and now you have a set of great grandparents. Okay, now that means that they have maybe multiple children, and maybe, one of those children, technically, those other children are going to be your grand aunts and uncles, right? Your grandparents, your grand aunts and uncles. Some people call those great aunts and uncles, but that is one of the struggles we have with the language that sometimes limits our understanding. So whoever, however you call them, whether you call them grand aunts and uncles or great aunts and uncles, they're going to be the siblings of your grandparents. Okay, same generation. Now we're going to add a child for that individual, and that individual is going to be the first cousin of your parent. Okay, so again, same generation. The child of your grand aunt or uncle is going to be the first cousin of your parent. That means that their children are going to be your second cousins. Again, because you're in the same generation, so no removes, and because the common set of ancestors is back another generation. Okay, are you confused yet? I'll run through this one more time. Like I said, I wanted to do it a little bit dynamically on screen so you could see it evolve, but let me just take a moment and explain. So here's you. As a matter of fact, let's just change that color a little bit so that you pop out of the middle of the page there. Okay, here's you. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. They have other great-grandchildren, and those other great-grandchildren are going to be your second cousins. So your grandparents' other grandchildren are your first cousins, and your great-grandparents' other great-grandchildren are your second cousins. Okay, so I hope you're starting to see what's happening here. We could just keep doing this. If we went back to great-great-grandparents, their other great-great-grandchildren would be your third cousins. If we went back to great-great-great-grandparents, their other great-great-great-grandchildren would be your fourth cousins. Okay, now I don't know if you can see my hands really clearly here, but hopefully you're seeing what's happening. If you have a set of 4 times great-grandparents, their other great-great-great-great-grandchildren would be your fifth cousins. So anytime you count the greats, the number of cousin they're going to be is always going to be one more. Okay, so your grandparents, there's no great in front of that word, which just means it's a first cousin. Great-great-grandparents, third cousins. 7 times great-grandparents, 8th cousins. Okay, but that all supposes that that person is in the same generation as you. As soon as you get off a generation, your second cousin's children are going to be your second cousins 1 time removed because they're in a different generation than you. Now, one word of caution. Sometimes we tend to think of generations as ages, and that is not always the case, okay? It's important to realize that when we're talking about generations and genealogy, what we're talking about is the number of steps, essentially, back to that common ancestor. So here for you, excuse me, it's allergy season in Utah. For you and your first cousin, it is 2 steps for each of you to get back to your grandparents. For you and your second cousin, it is 1, 2, 3 steps, and then 1, 2, 3 steps to get back to that common set of great-grandparents. Okay, so generation just means it's the same number of steps back to the common ancestor. Removed is when you add in a step. Now, like I said, this is important because a lot of times people get it stuck in their head that it has to do with age. So just to give you an example from my own family, my grandmother is the oldest of 5 children. So, and there's 16 years difference between my grandmother and her youngest brother. And what that means is that the oldest one of my dad's cousins is in her 70s, and the youngest one of my dad's first cousins is in her 30s. So you end up with this 40-year spread of grandchildren being born in this family because of a 16-year spread in children. My grandmother's sister had her first child, I believe, when she was 18, And that youngest brother, who's 16 years younger, he had his youngest child when he was well into his 40s. He may have even been in his early 50s. And so we've got grandchildren in this family with a 40-year age difference, but they are still first cousins because they all have the same set of grandparents. So, like I said, hopefully that starts to work in your brain a little bit and help you understand this. In real life, doesn't matter. A cousin is a cousin. But on paper, it matters because it helps you understand where to place someone. So let's just look at my tree for a minute. Again, this is another way to look at this same concept so that you can start to understand how to fit people into your family tree or where they might go so that you can do some additional research. So this is my grandfather's family tree. So we're going to go, all these relationships are going to be based off of my grandfather. So these are his parents, which means anybody who is a child of those same parents is going to be my grandfather's sibling. These are my grandfather's 4 grandparents, Park, Carrie, Julius, and Joanna. And what that means is that anyone who is a grandchild of any of those same people through one of their other children is going to be my grandfather's first cousins. Robert and Mary, Joseph and Mary, Carl and Wilhelmina, it happened. These are my grandfather's great-grandparents, which means any other great-grandchildren of theirs are going to be my grandfather's second cousins. These are my grandfather's great-grandparents, which means any other great-great-grandchildren of theirs are going to be my grandfather's third cousins. Okay, so that's how you start to figure out where those people fit in the family tree, because maybe you have somebody who's a relative, or you've come across somebody who has some of these same people in their family tree, and you're trying to figure out that relationship so you know where they fit. Well, that's how you do that math. Again, you count back to the common ancestor. So if it's a great-great-grandparent and they are also another great-great-grandchild, they would be a third cousin. As soon as the generations get off, that's when you have to start adding the removes. Now, DNA is where we start to see this really become important to understand, because every time you go down a step on any one of these little ladders here that we've created, so you go up a step and then you come back down a step, anytime you move a position on this little chart to get to another person on the tree, the DNA gets cut in half. So a parent and a child would share 50% of their DNA. An individual and their grandparent would share 25% of the DNA, because that's half of 50. You and an aunt or uncle, right? Okay, so are also going to share about 25% of your DNA, but then it starts to get cut in half every time you take a step down. You're going to share about 12.5% of your DNA with a first cousin. You're going to share about 6% of your DNA with a first cousin once removed. You're going to share about 3% of your DNA with a first cousin twice removed. If you come up this way, you're going to share about 12% of your DNA with great-grandparents or great-aunts and uncles. You're going to share about 6% of your DNA with your parents' first cousin, which actually would be your first cousin once removed, because you're in a different generation. You're going to share 3% of your DNA with a second cousin. You're going to share 1.5% of your DNA with a second cousin one time removed. So the idea is every time you take a step, it's going to cut that DNA in half. Now, we've tried to give you some of that information. So here, this individual is on my DNA match list, and she's got a cryptic username there, and she has a very small family tree. You can see here, it looks like she's still living, her mother is still living, her father is deceased. So I might be able to pull up her father's obituary, see who his wife is, flesh out a family tree for them to see if I can figure out how they're related to me. I can see how much DNA the two of us share by clicking on that little I right there, and it'll tell me we share 58 centimorgans of DNA. I can click on the little what does this mean link, and it'll give me a chart that tells me exactly what that means. The possible range of the predicted relationship here is fourth cousins with a range of fourth to sixth cousins. And there's a link here that says, what does this mean? And it is going to pop up charts like I've just been showing you. So you can see here, this is what a fourth cousin is. That's what this chart is telling you. It's saying, here's you, and this is your parent and your grandparent, and your great-grandparent, your great-great-grandparent, and your great-great-great-grandparent. Remember, 3 greats means anybody in the same generation as you is going to be your fourth cousin. And so we've tried to provide a lot of labels here so you can understand what that means. So this would be your great-great-grandparent's sibling. This would be your great-grandparent's first cousin. This would be your grandparent's second cousin. This would be your parent's third cousin, which means you would be fourth cousins with this individual. But if you keep scrolling down, you're going to discover that there are some people other than fourth cousins with whom you share the same amount of DNA. Okay, so up to that set of, now we've got 4 times great-grandparents, which means your grandparent might have a third cousin match, or you might have a DNA match who is your grandparent's third cousin. That makes them your third cousin 2 times removed. Okay, again, scroll down, you're going to see different views of what this might mean. So just because somebody is listed on your DNA match list as a fourth cousin does not mean they're an exact fourth cousin match. It could mean that they are a degree or 2 removed, one direction or the other, in order to get back to that common set of ancestors. Well, that was kind of, we went from cousins 101 to cousins 201 to cousins 301. If you're still back at 101, that's okay. Just maybe keep replaying that first part of the video or looking at those charts to see if you can wrap your head around it. As you progress in your genealogy journey, you're going to discover that this makes more and more sense as you go. So just a couple of tricks to keep it all straight. First, you need to decide who is the common ancestor and how many steps back is it to that individual. Is it a grandparent? Is it a great-grandparent? Is it a great-great-grandparent? Right? Who is the possible common ancestor, or who is the known common ancestor? And then the cousin number is always going to be one more than the number of greats, but that's for the closest relationship. So if you're in the same generation, common 3 times great-grandparents, you're fourth cousins, right? One more than the number of greats. If you're in different generations, that's when you start to get removed. Now, the number of cousin is always based on the closest relationship, and that is not always going to be you. So it might be your 4th great-grandparent, and so you might think, oh, that means they're my 5th cousin, but it might be their 3rd great-grandparent, which means 4th cousin, 1 time removed. Okay, so if it's their 3rd and your 4th, or your 4th and their 3rd, you always take the closest relationship to calculate the cousin number. Hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I will be monitoring those and answering them as I can. I know that this topic can get really confusing for some of you, but like I said, when you're at a family gathering, everybody's a cousin, everybody's in. But once you start putting together a family tree, it's important to start getting your mind wrapped around some of these concepts. And once you start working with DNA, it becomes really critical, because the specific definition of the actual relationship between 2 individuals is important, because the actual relationship is what determines one of the determining factors for how much DNA the 2 of you share. Hopefully that made sense. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.